energy Now I request Anika, the Vice President of Heritage Association, to please invite our two invitees with special gift. Yes. Special invitees, Dr. Kumkum Srivastava, who is our retired faculty member. Okay. Yes. Now I request Anika to please felicitate the guest, Dr. Narottam Vineet. He's Associate Professor, Department of History, Vyal Singh College. Moving ahead, I would like to invite our teacher in charge, Dr. Manisha Sharma, to please introduce the speaker.
हम बोल रहे हैं ना, तो यहाँ वॉइस एको कर रहा है पीछे वाले स्पीकर पर, बोलना नहीं।
Can we go to the beginning? I
Yes,
don't know
ma'am.
how to-
बहुत अच्छा लगता है क्योंकि मेरे को अपने कॉलेज के दिन याद आ जाते हैं। और मेरे को कहा गया था कि मैं ऐसे विषय पर बोलूं जो स्टूडेंट्स के सिलेबस से रिलेटेड हो। और आई एम सॉरी, ये है सिलेबस से रिलेटेड, पर इसमें बिल्कुल ही आइडियाज बिल्कुल ही अलग है। और ये इसलिए क्योंकि ये जो आइडियाज मैं आपको बता रही हूँ वो 40 साल से रिसर्च में है, लेकिन लोग अभी भी लोगों की कुछ धारणाएं हैं 6th सेंचुरी बीसी को लेकर, जिसको वो सोचते हैं कि ऐसा ही था। And the first thing I like to say, when you talk about ancient Indian history, you cannot speak in such confident terms. You have to be very tentative. थोड़ा झिझक के बोलिए कि प्राचीन भारत में कैसा था, क्योंकि हमारे स्रोत बहुत ही विस्तृत हैं और जो भी स्रोत हैं वो एक ही चीज के बारे में, एक धारणा के बारे में नहीं है। उनमें कई, एक ही स्रोत में कई धारणाएं आती हैं, ऑल्टरनेटिव ओपिनियंस आते हैं। टेक्स्ट को हूबहू नहीं मान लेना चाहिए जो वो कह रहे हैं, because that's a problem. And so the entire premise why I said we need to revisit the 6th century BC is because of this fact that we need to acknowledge that such data has been in the public space, in your textbooks which you are reading, but you still have this notion that 6th century BC was a watershed moment in Indian history. It was not. And I'm not sure how. Can somebody help me change the slide? I don't know what to press. Okay, I got it. So why is there a need to revisit the 6th century BC? अभी भी लोग धार्मिक रेवोल्यूशन की बात करते हैं. There is no such, when we look at the sources, we'll understand that it's not only in 6th century BC. Such shifts are traceable from earlier times, if you see the Upanishadic literature, and also in the whole notion of the shamanic traditions, and how shamanic traditions are something which are very disparate and diverse and cannot be put into categories that we put like Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivikas, etc. It was a very, very diverse category. And so do not talk of it in terms of religious revolution. Also, the notion of the territorial monarchies. And these very elaborate lists are given, 16 Mahajan Pads, these are the Gansangs, and you have this idea that 16th century में सारे states territorial monarchies की तरह चल रहे थे और बीच में थोड़े से गनसंग थे. Now, archaeologically, we do get evidence of the sites where such so-called territorial monarchies would have been. But we don't get any evidence of the administrative system, their dynastic lineages. Those come much later. So please do not be so assertive about this whole notion of the state formations in 6th century BC. And the whole notion of the 16 Mahajanpads, also 16 is a very convenient number in terms of all theological texts, whether it's Brahminical texts or Buddhist texts or the Jain text. So be little suspicious of such convenient numbers. Gana Sanghas themselves are a very, very debated and something which has been discussed. What was the internal polity? They were not uniform. Not all the Gana Sanghas regulated their lives in the same way. So it's also been seen as a period of significant social economic changes, urbanization, monetization, and we'll talk about that. This cursor is not, when you shift the slide, it doesn't work. Or I'm not doing it properly. Can you help? Okay, now it's what you have to move the mouse and
Just press this button.
so what we need to do is look beyond 6th century BC, what was happening before that, what was happening after that. All the developments that have been attributed to 6th century BC in the context of South Asia was not in that century always. Some of the processes of change are already in motion, like the Upanishadic thoughts. Some of the earliest Upanishads are from 7th century BC. Other changes, like the date of Buddha itself, is now, they say it's 5th century BC. So that itself is something which one has to take context of. So when we talk about history, क्योंकि आप सब इतिहास में रुचि रखते हैं या इतिहास के स्टूडेंट्स हैं, हिस्ट्री इज बेसिकली द इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ सोर्सेस. किस तरह से आप स्रोतों की व्याख्या करते. सो हियर टू थिंग्स आर इंपॉर्टेंट, source and interpretation. And that is why when we talk about history, especially ancient Indian history, you have to emphasize on source. किस सोर्स से क्या आपको ज्ञान मिल रहा है. और जब आप वो देखेंगे तो आप देखेंगे कि जो बुद्धिस्ट इमेजिनर, जिसको पाली इमेजिनर कहा है स्कॉलर्स ने, उसका अलग ट्रोप है, ब्राह्मणिकल का अलग है. और इसलिए जब भी आपको कुछ मिले एविडेंस तो आप बोलिए बुद्धिस्ट ग्रंथों ने ऐसा कहा है और इस बुद्धिस्ट ग्रंथ ने ऐसा कहा है, और ये नहीं मानिए कि ऐसा है. Both Brahminical, Buddhist, even the other sources, Jain sources, Ajivikas, we don't have anything, we only know from secondary sources, have to be problematized. And you have to fix some kind of a chronology to them. So while history is interpretive, that doesn't mean any and every interpretation is acceptable. जिसने जिस तरीके से व्याख्या की वो नहीं, वो सही नहीं है, ऐसा नहीं कि कोई भी व्याख्या सही है. In historical studies, the methods, क्या विधि से आप स्रोत को approach करते हैं. So the methods that a historian adopts to retrieve history from sources plays a very important role. And that is why writing or commenting on the past is very challenging. It's very complex. Everybody can't say प्राचीन भारत में ऐसा हुआ. अगर आप trained historian हैं तब आपको कुछ हद तक हक है बोलने का कि प्राचीन भारत में क्या हुआ. और उनको भी trained historians को भी बहुत ही झिझक से बोलना पड़ता है कि प्राचीन भारत में ऐसा हुआ. So one needs to have the necessary expertise to interpret sources. There's need for rigorous training in the discipline. What questions historians raise, that is what they will recover. So in the context of ancient history of subcontinent, while arranging and presenting the sources, there are some generalizations, sweeping statements that are made. चंद्रगुप्त मौर्य ने ऐसा कहा. चंद्रगुप्त मौर्य के बारे में हमें कुछ नहीं पता. सबसे पहले उनका वर्णन या तो पुराण में या फिर गुप्त काल में आता है. So, and then you think that the Greek sources, because they say Sandrocotus is Chandragupta Maurya. So, we have very oblique references. तो अगर आपको कोई बोल रहा है कि इसने ऐसे किया, उसने ऐसे किया, और ये बिंबिसार ये था और अजात शत्रु ने ऐसा किया, तो वो सही नहीं होगा, क्योंकि आप ये बोलेंगे कि इस ग्रंथ में ऐसा लिखा है कि अजात शत्रु ने ऐसा किया, और इस ग्रंथ का ये विशेष वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट है ऐसा कहने में. The intentionality of the text and the source. So actually, if you see it, one of the most important sources that we get for ancient India are Ashoka's edicts. Ashoka doesn't mention the word Maurya. Ek baar bhi nahi. He doesn't mention his father. He doesn't mention his grandfather. So the entire premise of Mauryan administration, Mauryan history, Ashok the Maurya, comes from later times, 200, 300, 400, sometimes 500 years later, we are constructing these histories. So be a little careful. And that is why Norman Yoffe, who talks about ancient societies, has said that you have to be little careful of history of totalities, that so and so did this, so and so did that, when there is no evidence for it. So also when it comes to Buddhist texts, you have to be careful. We are already careful with Brahminical texts. You have to be careful with the Buddhist lists also, because Gregory Chopin has said this, that there is need to question what the Buddhist, this over dependence on Buddhist text, and then you create an entire narrative on that basis. So in this talk, you can tell me whenever you want me to stop, because I tend to, and we started little late, so whenever you feel. We will be discussing date of Buddha, the importance of the Bhabru Berat Calcutta Edict of Ashok, the evidence relating to Shramanic schools of thought. Sare texts with talk about religious intellectual fervor of 6th century BC based on this sutta in the Digha Nikaya, where the 6 thinkers are mentioned, the Samaya Phalla Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. उसमें इन 6 लोगों के का वर्णन है कि ये बुद्धकालीन लोग हैं. But the Digha Nikaya is a later edition, and the manner in which the sutta is written itself shows an elaborate construct of making an hagiography of a king. Who's the king? Ajat Shatru. Ajat Shatru has gone to is taking the advice of Jivaka and then go to Buddha for advice, and Buddha says, have you taken advice from anyone else earlier? And he names these 6 thinkers. So it's a very hagiographical style of writing. So just on that basis कि ये 6 thinkers थे बुद्ध के काल में, और बुद्ध और अजात शत्रु ये सारे एक दूसरे से परस्पर विचार विमर्श करते थे, उस बेसिस पे आप पूरा रिलीजियस रेवोल्यूशन का थ्योरी बनाते हो, जो कि हो भी सकता है ना भी हो सकता है, क्योंकि ये कंपाइलेशन 200 साल बाद हो रहा है, और जिस तरीके से कंपाइलेशन हैजियोग्राफिकल कंस्ट्रक्ट हो रहा है वो बहुत देर बाद में होता है. सो little bit, there is a little bit need to question and problematize these sources. Also, the evidence relating to the Mahajanpads and the Gan Sangha and the evidence of the early Upanishads need to be questioned. Now, the date of Buddha is there. We have all been talking about it. Historians have been talking about it. It is contentious. Peter Harvey calls Buddhism a Shramanic movement, that it evolves from Shamanism. And he says that in its early phases, the emphasis was on dharma, teachings, and philosophy. And it's only much later that the life of Buddha came to be talked about. So it was not a personality-driven cult even from the very beginning. But only later on कि बुद्ध की जो जीवनियां हैं, या जो किस तरीके से उनका जन्म हुआ और क्या क्या वो उनकी माता ने सपना देखा, और ये सब जीवनी बाद में ऐड की गई हैं. So you can see how there is, even in the history of religions, there is a historicity, and in the beginning, they emerge as some kind of alternative systems of thought. And it's later that the followers make it more institutionalized. उनको एक व्यापक तरीके से संगठित करके, उनको ऑर्गेनाइज करके वो बाद में होता है, उस समय नहीं हो रहा है. So it's been 40 years since the discussions on Buddha's date has been published and been talked about. Beckert had this symposium in 1988, and then it continues. And the date of Buddha is debated on the basis of texts found in the Buddhist tradition. So you have one version saying it was 623 BC, and that the death takes place in 543 BC. Another date suggested is 566 BC, and the date is 486 BC. This long chronology, which puts 218 years between Ashok and Buddha, has been adjusted. There is a shorter chronology, which is based on other Sanskrit East Asian traditions, which just puts 100 years between Ashok and Buddha. And this is suggests 450 BC and 370 BC. So there are multiple dates being suggested for Buddha. Some of the now what are accepted dates are, like Gombrich says, it's 484 to 404 BC. Witzel says it's 460 to 380 BC. So the whole point in my discussion is to say that there aren't those type of concrete dates for ancient India as we give. So be little careful about such assertive histories which give concrete dates. Buddha is also said to be a contemporary of Mahavir, whose dates are supposed to be 528, 512 BC. Here too, there are discrepancies within the Jain traditions themselves. The Shvetambara and the Digambara dates differ. So you cannot really be very confident about Buddha's date. That is what I'm trying to say. The other thing is the significance of Ashok's Bhabru, or the Bharat Edict. This is the only historical record which there would be others, but the Lumbini one is suspicious, and nobody can really say the veracity of Ashoka's minor edict in Lumbini. This Bharat Edict tells us about Ashok talks about how there are these discourses that have to be followed. And he says, I'm a follower of Shakyamuni. So from that, we get to know that he is Raja, he is the king of Magad, Piyadasi, who is a follower of Shakyamuni. The other thing that we know is that he talks about internal dissensions within Buddhism. And even in Ashoka's time, there's no reference to the Buddhist canon, the Tripitakas. He is only talking about some of the discourses like the Vinay Samusaka, etc., etc. So these teachings are there, which Ashok records, but he makes no mention of the Buddhist canon, the Tripitakas. And so we know even in the time of Ashok, there is no canon, Buddhist canonical literature which has been formulated as yet, or at least Ashok doesn't know about it. He is not recording it. Ashok in this inscription says that monks and nuns should repeatedly listen to these expositions of Dhamma and reflect on them. So here you see the intervention of the ruler in the Buddhist Sangha. It also seems to imply that even in his time, the sermons are oral traditions and not really written down. Canonization, जब आप ग्रंथ, बुद्धिस्ट ग्रंथ त्रिपिटकों की बात करते हैं, तो वो बाद में हुए. अशोक काल में भी ये ग्रंथ नहीं थे. ये हमें edict ये बताता है. So canonization was an ongoing process, and Ashok himself seems to have been an active participant in the process of canonization. sortition कि किस चीज को छांटेंगे, किसको रखेंगे ग्रंथों में, किसको हटाएंगे, elimination, all these are processes which religious texts go through. And when we talk about Buddha's life stories or hagiographies and all those life events, they come much later, that is 200 BC to 200 CE. Now, when we talk about the emergence of Shramana traditions, it is difficult. Again, there's a debate about that. So Richard Gombrich, Michael Witzel say that early Buddhism borrowed from Upanishadic practices, and that seems to be quite logical. However, there are others like Johannes Bronkhorst who have said that Greater Magadha had its own cultural traditions, which were later on incorporated by the Brahmika, and especially something like stupa building. The tupa is something which was a part of the Greater Magadha tradition. Now, this whole understanding of Greater Magad as being the area which has a different notions or has different way of thinking is interesting, because then our interaction of the Brahminical thinking with this alternative Shramanic thinking, are they different, two opposites, and or are they coming from same traditions, is something that is again, which is debatable. Now, when we talk about the emergence of Shramana traditions, even in Buddhist texts, the Tripitaks, which were compiled much later, they mention the tradition of the Parivrajakas roaming around and how they lived through the arms of the householders. So household economy and production becomes very critical for transition, social, economic transitions in this period. And it's something that I have worked on in my work on the Grey Sutras, but also in an article which I wrote on how household economy paved the way for complex organizations like the Sangha, or even the early states and guilds and all. So household economy becomes important in the emergence of Shramana traditions. And then this whole idea that you're calling them heterodox, sects which are against orthodoxy, is also not correct, because when you say heterodox, are they responding to orthodox Vedic Brahmanism? Maybe not, because Vedic Brahmanism, we are saying, is prevalent in the northern regions, and East was still quite an unfamiliar area. In fact, if you see the Shatpat Brahman, the region of the East, they are called Asurya Prachaya, which means the demonic people of the East. So the even in Shatpat Brahman, there's not that much familiarity between the Western notions of thought and the Eastern notion of thought. Even till the time of Patanjali. So we are talking about एक तरफ तो histories है, rise of Magad and consolidation of the Magad state and the Nanda rule, etc., etc. Patanjali in 150 BC, when he is, I mean, that's a supposed date also, that's not a concrete date. When he's talking about Aryavart, he is only talking about the area around Ganga Yamuna Dua. And it's only later Manu's time, which is 2nd century CE, that Aryavrat is land between the two seas. So even in Patanjali, after all this, we have this notion that Sara North India consolidate ho gaya hai, Nandas के बाद और Mauryans के बाद. 150 BC में जब पतंजलि लिख रहे हैं तो वो ईस्टर्न एरिया आर्यव्रत को अलग मान रहे हैं. So please be little careful in our history of totalities relating to ancient India, because we are not, the texts give us only one mind view and one trope which we have to talk about. Then when we talk about the emergence of Shramanic movements, it seems that Brahmanism was not popular in the regions east of Yamuna Ganga, as Patanjali shows. We've already mentioned that canonical records relating to Buddha and Mahavir are later. And when these canonical literature, which were oral traditions, when they start being written, they have their own complexities. जब आप कुछ मौखिक परंपरा को लिखित परंपरा में बदलते हैं तो फिर उसमें भी बदलाव आते, changes आते. So then, it's the questions of names, कौन से नाम डाले, कौन से नहीं डाले, राजाओं के डाले, the dynastic lists come much later. So we really, all our information is coming from texts which are at least 200, 300 years later. And we have to be conscious of these, problems. Now, coming to the Samayafal Sutra of the Digha Nikaya, it refers to the king Ajatashatru, who is feeling sad. And on the advice of his minister Jivaka, he goes to the forest to seek Buddha. He is surprised by the quiet serenity of the place. And there he sees 1,000 monks sitting very quietly. On Buddha's questioning that, have you sought advice from somebody else? He mentions these 6 thinkers: Purana Kashyap, Maskarin Goshaliputra, Ajita Keshakamblin, Pakuda Katyayan, Sanjayan Viraliputra, Nirghantra Gyatiputra, who is actually Mahavir, who is said to be the founder of Jainism. Now, the context, please don't take it at its face value. That's all I'm asking for. The context is very important. Buddha is explaining his philosophy to the king Ajatashatru, who is convinced by Buddha, whereas he is not convinced by anyone else. These are Buddhist texts. So that is what they will promote. That is what they are saying. That also this whole notion of him being a patricide. Now, this is again a very familiar trope in Buddhist literature. The evil, violent ruler who becomes reformed or philosophical after coming in contact with Buddha. How much of the passage is a historical fact? How much of it is an imaginative construct by the compilers of Digha Nikaya is very difficult to say. That's all. I'm not saying it's because there's no fact finding, there's no way that we can sit down and have a fact finding inquiry over this. We have to leave it at that. What I'm saying is that don't assert that this is what happened. It can be in the realms of imaginative constructs. Buddha's interactions with contemporary rulers like Ajatashatru is couched in hagiographical style, and whether it can at all be accepted needs to be scrutinized. But these continue to be the basis of our understanding of 6th century BC. And so we need to think about it. We have to think about the intention behind including such an episode in the text. The aspiration of Buddhist teachers to be advisors of the king. Ajatashatru is seeking Buddha for advice. This is mentioned in a Buddhist text, which means that the Buddhists want the kings to come and take their advice. This king seeking out answers to questions is a familiar motif in the Upanishads too. And you have the whole philosopher King Janak, engaging with Yajnavalkya and all the great philosophers of that time. The Samayafal Sutra says that the king was seeking a discourse on dharma, which again points to the fact that any meaningful ethical discourse was seen as dharma, not only Buddhist thought. So the sutra says that he wants to know about dharma. Also, the sutra says Buddha's philosophy appealed where others had failed. It also seems to say that kings are expected to have anxieties related to consequence of their actions, which is again a basic philosophy of Buddhism. That जो action करें उसका क्या reaction होगा, क्या उसका होगा, उसके बारे में सोचना चाहिए. So basically, the sutra is important for that, but not as an actual recording of a historical event which may or may not have happened. And also it is a suspiciously repetitive motive. It seems to also talk about the king's desire for power. The 6 thinkers' viewpoints later on evolve into 6 very comprehensive schools of philosophy, Vaisheshika, etc. So that also seems to be too convenient. 6 schools of philosophy which evolved later are the 6 school thinkers, which are, Lokayat philosophy, the Vaisheshika philosophy, all derived from this 6 thinkers. And the passage also shows maybe to the resources that is available to a king and the differentiation in lifestyles between the kings and commoners. And in that sense, also tells us that, yes, there was a fairly eclectic milieu in which Buddha may have taught and spread his ideas. But whether he was interacting with Bimbisar and Ajatashatru and these events happened is something which is in the realm of speculation. Also, this desire for king's patronage is a very important aspect that we have to look into when we talk about the text, because there are competing claims regarding kings as patrons. So if you see these early kings of Magad, Shrenika, Bimbisar, and Ajatashatru, they're both, the Buddhists say they were their followers and the Jains say they, and these both Buddhist and Jain texts are later texts. So they do say that. The Nandas who ruled from Patliputra supposedly were in later traditions described as patrons of the Jains. Chandragupta Maurya was supposed to be a promoter of Jainism. Kautilya's intervention seemed to be a later Brahminical imaginative construct. Again, dates of Kautilya, not before 200 BC. So you cannot learn Mauryan administration from Kautilya's Arthashastra. You can learn Kautilyan administration from Kautilya's Arthashastra. Okay, so this is just one way of understanding and knowing the sources. Even now, when you talk about Mauryan administration, it is taught by, first thing that you're taught is Kautilya said they had these 7 wings and this. Kautilya, the dates for Kautilya are very contentious. And we have to be conscious that the first time the equation of Kautilya with Chandragupta with Vishnugupta is done in the Gupta period, which is many, many hundred years after the modern period, where there's a resurrection of Chandragupta Maurya and possibly a Brahminical appropriation of the Mauryan dynasty, which is being mentioned in the Puranic lists. So we really don't know anything. In fact, if you read Witzel's recent article, not so recent, 2019, he says we don't know anything about Magad. And a whole history of Magad has been created through this whole idea of what has been reconstructed in Buddhist, Brahminical, and Puranic literature. So, Ashok, we know, turned to Buddhism because he himself admits it, but he's also donating to Ajivikas because we have the donations in the Ajivika caves. And so there is a different kind of milieu. Now, that's what I'm trying to say is that when we take textual representations as sources, they're still important. आप ग्रंथों में क्या आपको इंफॉर्मेशन ज्ञान मिल रहा है वो महत्वपूर्ण है क्योंकि वो सोच दिखाता है उस समय की, पर इसलिए नहीं कि कौन राजा क्या कर रहा था और कैसे कर रहा था, क्योंकि वो अपने आप बना सकते हैं. So also that when we talk about the text, you get to know about anxieties. What are the problems? Also, and it's not as if all these cults have mutual understanding and respect for each other. They make disparaging remarks about each other. And later on, Ashoka's appeal for Brahman, Shaman, and harmony shows that there was tension for all kinds of, for space, for patronage, for following, etc. Now, do we have time? Should I continue? Okay. Okay, thank you. So now just very quickly, I'll go through the Mahajanpad systems. So the states seem to be categorized in a very neat dual categorization, 16 Mahajanpads vis-a-vis the Gansangs, and that the territorial monarchies existed with the Gansangs. They are not understood to be republics. They seem to be oligarchies or the Kshatriya sort of lineages, as Romila Thapar calls them. Actually, we do not have a clear account of which states existed and when. And the textual lists have been taken as a standard, and archaeological evidence is matched against these lists, which is itself a problem. Because if you enter archaeology, there's this whole school of thought of how if you enter archaeology through textual, taking text as a base, that itself has problems. Because you're assuming that the text has, that kind of a wide base. It may not. अगर आप ऋग्वेदिक एरिया को ढूंढेंगे, हो सकता है ऋग्वेद एक ही फैमिली के एक ग्रुप में लिखा जा रहा था और उस पूरा एरिया का so you can't archaeologically look for Rigvedic sites, because Rigved itself, we don't know who had access to or who was writing or how many people had access to that knowledge. Just because it has come down to you doesn't mean that whole of India was, that Rigved was accessible then. So be a little careful about that. Now, the problems with the sources. If you see archaeological sites, and mainly we are looking at NBPW sites for Mahajanpads, painted graveware, upper layers transiting to NBPW sites. And for archaeology, maybe you people should consult Conningham and Young, because some of the discussions are there. So a lot of the archaeological remains actually show existence of sites in the areas which are later listed as the Mahajanpads, but many are still not discovered. Like the list mein hai Chedi, Asmaka, wo pata nahi kahan hai. Interestingly, none of the lists mention Kalinga, whereas we know from Ashoka's reference to the conquest of Kalinga that Kalinga existed as a state in pre-modern, I won't even use the word modern, pre-Ashokan times. So lists don't have Kalinga. They don't have Kalinga because by the time they were being written, probably Kalinga was part of some other place. We don't know. So actually the evidence that is supposed to be for 6th century BC related to the dynastic states and the names of rulers comes hundreds of years later in canonical texts like the Majjhima Nikaya and the Digha Nikaya, whose narrative is obviously going to be driven by vested interests and the need for state patronage. And also, they will have some problems. Texts are problematic. They can only lead us into conceptualizations relating to state and other aspects of society and philosophy, but cannot be relied upon for making chronological, sequential, dynastic histories and accurate biographies of persons pertaining to this region. And in fact, there are scholars who have said that all these kingly narratives are contrived, made up. आपको याद नहीं आया, आप 200-300 साल बाद लिख रहे हैं, तो फिर कुछ ऐड किया, कुछ डिलीट किया, यहाँ से लिया, वहां से लिया. So how are you going to actually rely on them? So the Digha Nikaya list refers to 10 states: Kashi, Koshal, Malla, Vajji, Cheti, Vans, Kuru, Panchal, Matsya, Surasen. It mentions Ang and Magad separately, but does not mention Aska, Avanti, Gandhar, and Kamboj. Now, probably at the time of Digha Nikaya, Gandhar and Kamboj are with the Achaemenids, and that is why it's not being mentioned. By the time of Alexander, the references to these regions seem to indicate prevalence of Indian rulers. But Alexander's time is much later, not 6th century BC. So at that time, they are being listed as Mahajanpads in later references. And Digha Nikaya has a lot of references to other types of terms for use of states. Nagar, Nigam, Gam, Janpad, Mahajanpad, Rath, Antararth, Tirotharth, Padesa, Desa, Mahajanpades, Gana, Sangha. So having this dual concept that Mahajanpads and Gana Sanghas itself is contentious. Reference to states as territorial monarchies may be a little far-fetched, as some of them are still associated with names of tribes like Kurus, Panchals, Surasen, and they are still getting used to territorial acquisition. So, ये जो क्षेत्रीय monarchies, territorial kingdoms आप कह रहे हैं, वो पता नहीं है भी या नहीं, और ये family names है, Kuru, Panchal, Sursen. Although Witzel talks about Kuru hegemonization of the Ganga Yamuna Dwar. So that is there. Further, since no chronology is mentioned, one doesn't know since when the territorial monarchies existed, where they existed together or at different times. एक खत्म हो गया, एक है, फिर भी उनको 16 के लिस्ट में, क्योंकि 16 नंबर करना है. So, these are possibilities, and also whether they were during the time of Buddha or contemporary to the time when the lists are being made, or, so in that case, they're 300 years later. And so it would seem as if rather than refer to merely two types of state systems, territorial and Gansanga, there could have been many different types of states that had existed, some with tribal and clan origins, what we call the chiefdoms, rulers who are constantly negotiating with traditional systems of governance, introducing new ideas. And so we have to also look at how, what are the features of the state when we talk about the rise of territorial states in this period. And it is increasingly, that idea that when we talk about state formation, that there's a pre-state and there is a state, that itself is now getting dissolved. And what they're saying is that the distinguishing features of the state are not that clearly marked. And sometimes it's better to discuss historical transitions as changes to complex societies, or even the word complicated society. तो आप राज्य के पहले और राज्य के बाद की धारणा ना लेकर आप जटिलता की धारणा लेके चले. और जटिलता doesn't mean evolution. We are not talking about unilinear evolution, but we are talking about, like Yoffe says, that these societies have subsystems which may be semi-autonomous, have diverse functions, and then they are brought together by generalized centers of political and economic administration. So when you see that there are linkages, that there is a system, which we can call the state system, with subsystems, and they get linked together by political and economic administration. But in early states, Yoffe says that these linkages are weak. And we need, these early states need new symbols of social identity, ideologues of power, and representation in history, how they represent themselves to bring themselves together. So then how does one distinguish a state? Rajya kya hai? So Yoffe says the existence of a political center with ability to express the legitimacy of interaction between the differentiated elements. ये जो subsystems हैं, इनमें जो interactions हो रहे हैं, उसको manage करना वैधता के साथ, तब आप राज्य की बात कर सकते हैं. And also then we have to talk about chiefdoms, and chiefdoms, and we are not talking about simple states. Long back in 1968, Marshal Salins had made this statement about the chief, that he says everything, he makes declarations and people listen to him and then they do what they please. That is a chiefdom. But time has changed since then, and now it's realized that the chief is not representative of a redistributive, egalitarian, semi-egalitarian economy. Chiefdoms have status. The chief is an elite who is controlling the prime resources, the prime land, the best land. He is dependent on dependent labor. The chiefs have a ritual status. They have goods given to them by the community during feasts. So what R.S. Sharma had called potluck system of semi-tribal, semi-egalitarian are actually very complex systems where the chiefs are actually owning land. And it's only because of their ritual status that gifts are being given to them. And it's not a voluntary potluck system that people, are envisaging. And so Yoffe says that you have to talk about looking at states not from top to bottom, but from bottom to top, where you have these power structures. Power emanates from different sections of the society, and there is a political center which tries to bind all these different power groups together. What do you think is happening in Ashoka's edict? Exactly that. Shramana, Brahmanas, all being brought together by his administrators, the Dhamma Mahamatras. So instead of looking at power from top to bottom, you have to look at power where there is power from different sections of society. And in fact, Yoffe quotes Clifford Yeats, who says that the state draws its force, which is a real force, real power. It's not imaginative power. It's real, from imaginative energies. What the जो वैधता जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, legitimacy, वो imagination में आती है through ideology. The semiotic capacity, आप words से, ideas से, the capacity to make inequality enchant. That you accept inequalities because you are identifying with something. And these may be different ways in which you identify with them, but you are brought together. So the relationship between the king, the elite, and the populace is constantly being negotiated and reworked in these state systems. The territorial association with a particular tribe or clan is also in the process of being constantly redrawn. So when we call them territorial states, that itself is a question mark, because the word Janpad, now early state was associated with the Jan, the populace. So they are not calling themselves territorial monarchies. They are calling them a confluence of people, Janpad. So where the people stay. So in that sense, and territorial boundaries were not fixed, they were nebulous and being reworked. So also this notion that Koshal and Magad emerge as power centers are there in the text. So that itself seems to be a tussle between the Upanishadic and the epic traditions, whereas Magad is Bimbisar, Ajatshatru, and the other regions. So there is some kind of an ideological tussle in that also. What we can recognize that was happening is that the Kuru, Panchal, Sursens are names of particular clans. Koshal, Magad are names of particular places. So it could not be uniform or even just two types of forms of states. There must have been different states with fluid boundaries, which were constantly being renegotiated depending on the power of the rulers. And in the process of state formations, different types of systems coexisted. And that is what we find. And even this whole idea that Buddha came from a ruling family. Some clans may have extended control only over a handful of villages. Others, larger territories, the Mallas, the Shakyas, Kolyas, Lichavis, they're all mentioned as autonomous when they was, so when they would grow strong, they would be powerful. When they were not that strong, then they would shrink. Buddha is supposed to have been born in a Gansanka of the Sakyas with the capital at Kapilvattu. Mahayana tradition calls him Shakyamuni. These are all later traditions, but Buddha's, the claim from in these texts that Shakya realm was a kingdom is itself not really credible, because his father is also shown as plowing a field. So he's undertaking occupation which is not a royal occupation. So Witzel says, we have to revise our well-established concepts and prejudices with evidence that is staring at us in our face. We hardly know anything about Magadh. So I think I'll stop here. I have some discussions about the Upanishads, but I'm not sure what the time. Okay. Let me see. Okay, this is the summary then. This period then has been viewed as different, differently. It needs to be viewed differently. Cunningham and Young call it a period of reintegration. They are following Schaffer's nomenclature, which, I mean, obviously has its own issues, but they also draw attention to how urbanization can also be called ruralization. Why? Because urban demographic implosion was accompanied by an equally important creation of the countryside, re-networking of existing villages to emergent urban forms, and creation of new specialist centers. So we are talking about an period of integration through networks of trade routes, rituals, belief practices, oral traditions, not necessarily through the Mahajanpad, Gan Sangha kind of a dichotomy that we always think of. And also this entire period, there is also active interaction with the Achaemenids. And you have archaeological evidence like the tulip bowls, which are associated with the Achaemenids. Then you have the megalithic burial practices also happening in the Deccan and Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of interaction with Sri Lanka also. So instead of talking about 6th century BC, we actually have to talk in terms of bands, 6th to 4th century BC, or in fact 6th to 2nd century BC, or 6th to 0, the common era, because there is no particular century which marks the watershed. And we also have to, rather than looking only for states and kingship and rise and fall of Magadh and Koshal and Magadh tussle, which are all in the realm of textual constructs. I won't say imaginative or not, because I have no power of knowing, but we have to look at this period from the angle of control of production and reproduction. The theories like the Upanishads. I had a whole section on Upanishads which I couldn't cover, I'm sorry. Life and afterlife, household production, social categorization, and all these need to concern us as much as emergence of state and kingship. And also, obviously, the whole notion of the religious thinkers. There are Shramanic thinkers. There must have been many of them. But who exactly they were and how they evolved and who was contemporary to who is something we have to think about and not take, ऐसे घुट्टी की तरह कि हाँ भाई दीर्घ निकाय में list है तो भाई वो सच ही होगा. So that's where I stop. Open to questions.
This is a very strange query, and the query is related to KBC. कौन बनेगा करोड़पति?
I'm so sorry, I don't see it, but yeah, I hope you're not asking one of the questions asked there. I'll have to phone a friend.
No, last September, 3 of my students who go back more than 30 years. They all qualified for the KBC. So what happened? They came to me and they just wanted to know something about history and what I found was, what are the sources which the KBC team is consulting for the questions that they put on the KBC regarding history? And especially, like you just mentioned about dates and all that, and they asked you a particular date or a particular, who was the contemporary of, say, Buddha, and then, they'll give you for names and that. And hearing you, I realized that most of the questions that they asked were not really, didn't have the right answer. Although they say,
Okay.
Nokia Chai,
Yeah.
this particular student of mine, what you call him a student, he himself is a grandfather now. And he was so disappointed because, and then he came and apologized to me that he had not been able to answer a particular question. It was based on the Buddhism and Jainism rose as a protest
Against Brahmanism.
which religion. So then you had
Vedic.
and of course, what he had heard and what he had read and what he had been hearing and speaking and talking about was, but as you said, that they were not, those heterodox and religions and all that, whether they were in differences of opinion and of ideology,
Yes.
prevalent religion. Was Hinduism really, Hinduism, Brahmanism, and was it really existing at that time? And he said no. And so, well, he didn't follow it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, please.
So I really don't know how to respond to that because I have not, but you're right. You see, why I chose to talk about this is because there are many assertions we just take for granted. In history, there was a person who used the word factoid, which means that, you keep saying the same thing again and again, and it's accepted as a fact. And where is the source for that? So that is why I say that we have to look at sources. And when we look for, when we say, okay, who was a contemporary of Buddha? So you have to say who was a contemporary of Buddha according to the Digha Nikaya. Okay. So that is the qualification, a person who's conscious of history. And that is why I mentioned this, who knows what history means. It means that you're studying the sources and you're interpreting the sources. So according to the Digha Nikaya, Buddha was a contemporary of these 6 thinkers. But all our standard textbooks have it. But my only humble submission is that if we are talking about ancient India, then we have to be a little, and even these textbooks will say it according to Digha Nikaya. But then the further sort of way it becomes, sort of absorbed by us is that 6th century BC was 16 Mahajanpads and Karna Sanghas, and this is how they interact. So the idea is that 6th century में 16 थे और फिर उनके बीच में गण संघ थे और फिर उसमें से कौशल और मगध में लड़ाई हुई और फिर मगध सुप्रीम हुआ और फिर उसके बाद एक के बाद एक पहले हर्यनकाज आए फिर नंदाज आए फिर मौर्यज आए फिर ये शिशुनाग whatever. Those are Puranic lists which are like 400 years, 500 years later. So कौन किसके बाद आया is थोड़ा सा we should be a little conscious कि भाई इस source में ऐसा लिखा है और ये source 200-300 साल बाद का है.
Well, I've told them not to give your father friend, don't put my name in video.
But the other thing is about history from DU is that we understand that there are no assertions. And whereas in other places, I'm not being disparaging about other places, but in very many places, people are teaching history like they, and then questions also come like that. आपके multiple choice questions आएंगे, date of Buddha 566 BC. And so you have to go with that, I guess. But here we have shown that there could be 5 possible dates of Buddha or no date. आप अपने grandmother की date पूछिए ना, मेरे को नहीं पता है, my grandmother's date. I cannot give a year. And आप बुद्धा का इतना assertive way में बोल रहे हैं कि 566 BC. So there has to be a tradition of recording those dates as per the Julian calendars, which was not there. Yeah, I think no, the Brahman, Shatpat Brahman.
What about those days? And what is the east of the Shatpatra? Where is the Shatpatra?
Yeah, actually, if I could do the Vedic, because that's my favorite comfort zone. So, as everybody will know. So, the Shatpat also is being written in the, Kuru Panchal area, which is like in the Ganga Yamuna Doa. Okay, so though all these areas are east. Yes, the east is kind of unknown. Yes, there is, what Patanjali calls the Kalata mountain. And there's a whole debate about where that mountain was and where it was. But it seems that anything beyond, what we know as Magad was not part of that area.
And the symbolism of the state as a center, the center that holds it together. How you brought out that point, right? The new ways of.
Yeah, but I also brought about the point that center is not something which is fixed and there is fluidity. And that there are multiple power groups. And, one can be there can be always a negotiation between them.
What we always teach, the manical monarch.
So that exists in the realm of the text. There are very good studies on that. So it is there, the notion of kingship, that was part of my Upanishad, the talk on Upanishad, the notion of kingship. How in the Vedic period, it is the king who is doing the rituals and all, but the Brahman is the mind. Whereas in the Upanishads, the king is teaching the Brahman, which is a total, reversal, role reversal. And the king teaching the Brahman about knowledge which nobody knows, the theory of karma or, the afterlife. Yes.
Thinking about it, that
The demons in the east. So there's the difference in that, yes.
so that we have many sources that talk about that how the East is perceiving the West perceiving. And secondly, when they are perceiving East in this manner, there's obviously the sense of unknown, right? But there might have been some kind of interaction. That's why Patanjali is representing these same states. So how do we understand this interaction, and do you see that maybe East is depicting or discussing about this, and we can understand their perspective?
So I'm not postulating that there was an East and West divide. Okay, there must have been interactions, and the interaction, because you see NBPW, if you see the pottery, there is so much. That is why they call it, Cunningham and Young are calling it a period of integration, because there's the standardization of products and commodities and goods and, networks of exchange. So there is a lot of interaction. But in the mindset of, it's like, if I'm a Marxist scholar, I may not engage with other scholars, or, so there is a whole school of thought which is emerging. Whereas, so in Patanjali's notion of the Aryavrat, the pure area is the Ganga Yamuna Doab still. By Manu, it's become the two seas. So that doesn't mean there wasn't interaction. There was plenty of interaction, but the mindset of the author when he's writing and his notion of what the Aryavrat is something. Ashok has already talked about the Jambu Dweep. So Ashok's notion of territoriality is different from Patanjali's notion of that. And they are working on different tropes and maybe interacting also, in terms of ideological constructs. I'm not saying Ashok was a contemporary of Patanjali and not interaction that, but ideologically there are interactions, I'm sure. But the fact is that you have to be conscious that because I'm a scholar and I'm writing in a particular way, doesn't mean that what I'm saying is relevant for everybody and everybody knows it. They don't. My work is known only in a very select section. 2000 baad, if you read it, then you'll say, oh, you know, this is what was happening. But it was not, because half the, maybe only 6 people have read the book. So that is why when we talk about Patanjali, you say in Patanjali's mindset, Aryavrat was that. And in Ashoka's inscription, he is talking about Jambudvi, which is later, Patanjali is supposedly later than Ashoka. So dates are not always possible, but we have to have some chronological
Is
sense.
there any particular reason? I mean, obviously, it's impossible to guess, but Patanjali mentions that why he's differently takes at this particular.
No, this quote is from Shatpat Brahman, the demonic people of the East. That's not from Patanjali. Shatpat Brahman is much earlier. Yeah, Shatpat Brahman would be maybe 1000 to 800 BC. So much earlier.
Anybody, you guys? This is something you use this assertiveness. So if we, and since the past years and the others sitting around, it's very good. I mean, I was also told the same way. If you look at the core identity of 6th century BC, so many indicators, key indicators are there. And one of them is the rise of orthodox sects. And so the Buddhism is not there. So I mean, if we look at the philosophy Buddha shared with us, people, so many things are there. The sacrifices to contemporary, karma kand na ho, known accumulation of money, go back to primitive lifestyle, and so many things. So if we compare this tradition of Buddha, methods and discipline, with the Upanishadic tradition, so many things are there. So
Yeah,
many similarities.
lots, yes.
बहुत कुछ है. And Upanishads are the one written in Sanskrit, right? तो एक general perception रहा है ये कि जो इस debate का माहौल है वो 6th century BC से शुरू हो रहा है और उससे पहले we don't find any kind of debate contest, but it is there. These are also Brahmin, the people who are writing Upanishads.
Yeah.
So, since you use this term assertive, I find it really
Yeah,
interesting.
this
Yeah,
is a very interesting point you have made, and I do talk. Later in the presentation, I do talk about it, about the difference in notions of knowledge and its transmission. So while the Vedic shakhas are the knowledge is very exclusive, कि बस शाखा में होगा और कहीं नहीं, और जब rituals होंगे तब मंत्रोच्चारण होगा. Upanishads still talk about elite, the kings and the Brahmins, but also that this knowledge should be only amongst certain people. Buddha totally changes that. He says knowledge hai to sabko jaake bolo, aur fir bhikkhu ko, bhikkhuni ko, sabko jaake batao. And except for those 4 rainy months when the bhikkhu, bhikkhunis are supposed to be within their viharas, they are supposed to be spreading the word of knowledge. So this idea of transmission of knowledge is very different of Buddha. And that is what is very significant. But that also, if Buddha's date only is 100 years later, and the notion of how the knowledge then spreads, that also will get shifted. Okay. But this is, why I think students should also have access to these possibilities is that आप graduate कर रहे हो history में और आपको ये जानना चाहिए कि इस पर debate है. अब आपको multiple choice questions का आंसर करना होगा तब तो आप standard answer लिखोगे जो बुद्धा का डेट है, या केबीसी में जाओगे तो फिर standard वाला देना आंसर, क्योंकि we all want you to become crorepati's. But the fact is that as history students, you should be able to stand up and say कि भाई बुद्धा का डेट नहीं पता किसी को, इस पे विवाद है और 4-5 डेट्स हैं और कोई आपसे बोले नहीं नहीं बुद्धा का डेट पता है, तो बोलना कि मेरे को तो अपनी दादी का परदादी का भी डेट नहीं पता है, तो आप बुद्धा का कैसे आप इतना असर्टिवली बोल रहे हो? So, I mean, I'm just trying to say that, when it comes to ancient India, people make these claims and, sort of, but that anything has to be backed up by sources. And so for students of history, source-based knowledge is most important. All right. I think I'll stop here.
I want to thank Professor Jaya Tyagi, very astute scholarship coming up, with very pertinent points, a revisiting of a very crucial period of Indian history, of course. And dating always has been an issue, and it continues to be an issue. I particularly liked this questioning of what is the orthodox and heterodox, and also sort of a decentering. So I really want to thank her for visiting our college and contributing to how we are gaining knowledge here. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, with that, we come to the end of the session, and I'm here to present the vote of thanks on behalf of Heritage, the Association of the History Department. First of all, we express deep gratitude to you, ma'am, for delivering the lecture under the Distinguished Speaker Series. I would just like to say that it was not just beneficial for the students, but for the faculty as well, because it reminded us of, historical methods in terms of interpretations, empathy, and writing and rewriting of history. And above all, it reminded us as historians, what responsibility lies on our shoulders. So thank you very much for that. I would like to thank all the faculty members who are present here, the TIC, Dr. Manisha Sharma, the association in charge, Dr. Tara Shimer, and our principal, Professor Swati Pal, who has been a constant support for all the programs that we organize. I thank all the students, and last but not the least, the association, students union of the association, who are a lifeline to all the events that we organize here. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.